Story number 1 of my haunted experiences at my childhood farm. I grew up on an old farm built in the late 40s. The farm wasn't extremely old since it got torn down and turned into a suburban neighborhood in 2015. However, my experiences there varied from getting chased by cows to being chased by Addie. There was a small, old, abandoned homestead about 100 yards from my house, and that's where Addie lived. She died in that house before the farm was built, and there wasn't much known about her. A few times a week, my friends who lived on a farm neighboring to me, my brother and I would go to Addie's house and explore. There was one particular experience that make my bones shiver when I remember it. It was in the evening and the sun was about set while we were in Addie's house. There were birds and crickets chirping outside, and we could hear the creaks as the cold breeze brushed against the house. Suddenly it went quiet. We couldn't hear the animals chirping anymore, and it was as if the wind got louder and harder, so we decided to head back home. As we headed out the front door, we heard footsteps on the second floor. My friend, being smart, decided to sprint towards our house, but the rest of us stayed put for a second in shock. And like a shot, we heard those footsteps stomping swiftly down the stairs, and we booked it. We ran inside my house and locked the door behind us. The stairs inside that old abandoned house were open and had no back, so you can see people coming up and down the stairs from the front door. I never spoke about it because I didn't want to scare anyone. But as we heard those footsteps coming down the stairs, I could see the silhouette of bare feet and ankles running down through the cracks of the steps. Story number 2. There's a chance I was near the murder of a child. It was my 6th grade year. I was hanging out with the daughter of my parents' friends. At the time, I had a crush on her, but that's a different thing. At the time, she had a friend of hers, her sister, my sister, and possibly my friend's half-sister along with us. We both had a fairly large family. Anyways, if my memory is correct, we just had lunch and was now playing hide and seek. Their house had a large backyard with a thick forest. I chose to go as deep as I could into the forest, knowing they wouldn't even bother to look there. There was one thing that struck me as odd. You see, her parents did set up a wooden bridge since there was a big enough creek connected to their land. Not too big, not too small. But when I walked through, I found a second bridge. Now at the time, it never struck me as odd. I just went over it and kept walking. I found a slab of oak wood just thrown in the forest. I can't remember whether or not it was a construction slab or just a piece of something else. I chose to sit on it so I wouldn't touch the dirt and grass and not get my pants dirty. As I sat, there would be a small opening that showed me a nice, beautiful field. A field you could frolic in for days. As I took in the sight, I then heard screaming. Not just any normal screaming, it was a child screaming bloody murder. By the way the scream sounded, whoever it was couldn't have been any older than 5. I stood there for a second before getting onto my feet and attempting to get to the sound, but the forest was just too thick. I ended up just booking it back to the house. They've already given up on looking for me, and when I explained what happened to my friend, they claimed that there was a shooting range nearby, and somebody could have gotten hurt. At first, I believed it. But then it struck me. Why didn't I hear a gunshot? The screams just appeared out of thin air, and from how close they were, I definitely would have heard a gunshot. I would have told the parents, but they weren't there at the time. Later, when I did inform both her and my parents about it that night at the bonfire, they looked at me weirdly. They were confused by loads of things, but one part really stuck out to me. That second bridge I found was never put there by them. That wouldn't be the first time I noticed strange activity at that cursed house. Once I heard what sounded like a tornado siren, but it sounded distorted and prolonged longer than usual, or when both me and my stepsister found a growing tree just wiggling left and right. It was at the point where wind couldn't blow it, nor was there a draft that night. Nonetheless, I'm not sure whether this was paranormal, someone actually being in danger, or hell, someone trying to lead me into a trap. As far as I'm concerned, I'm the only person who was close to this, and nobody ever takes me seriously. Story number 3. I saw God in my dream. I know it's a stretch to say I saw God, but you have to hear me out. I myself do not believe in a God of any kind, so I'm not very convinced, but damn, this made me rethink shit. So it was just a normal day, nothing special, got home, had dinner, went to bed. This was last night. My dream started, or I remember it starting, in a forest-type area, reminded me of Alaska. I can remember walking by a large lake, just peacefully strolling until I saw it. a tall, scrawny creature on all fours. It had long, skinny arms and legs with gray skin, and its spinal column is pushing up against the skin. You can see its ribs and hip bone like a sick dog. It had a long neck that reached down to my height, and its face. Its face was just 3 black circles. They looked like they had been drawn on it with a broken pen. 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom, like 3 black voids that only just managed to make the vague shape of a face. I could feel the energy from this thing, like its power was affecting the world around it, vibrating reality just by existing. It spoke to me, but instead of hearing it, I could more feel its voice in my head. This is what I remember it saying: "You are nothing. I am God." Then it said something like, "Deus adeste." I have no clue what that means, but it said it. Right after that, I woke up in a sweat, my back and forehead drenched with anxiety sweat. I don't think it was just another nightmare or dream, because this shit has stuck with me. I cannot get it out of my head. Whatever this thing is, it does not like humans. The only energy I could possibly pick up off of this creature was hatred. It was evil, and it is coming. Story number 4. Strange camping experience. Explanation, our theories. A few years ago, I was camping with some friends in East Tennessee. This is a lesser-known campsite that is not very well marked. There is a road crossing a creek, and on the right side there is a single campsite, where we were, and on the left side there is a string of maybe 4 campsites following down the creek. The road is on higher ground, so you have to make your way down a hill on either side. About 1:30 a.m., 2 big pickup trucks pull up and set up at the first campsite across the road. We all thought it was really strange that people would be getting there so late. After some time and unloading, they got a huge fire burning and had a very bright lights that lit up their whole area. They also had like a small, tall stand-up tent, like some type of pop-up changing privacy room. That was it. This is where it started to get weird, and my memory is not completely reliable because alcohol was involved. It looked to me like they had some type of weird outfit on, like robes, jackets, or some other clothing of importance, maybe purple or dark blue in color. And they kept going in and out of the tent while the others were moving about and around the fire. It was so bizarre to us that we couldn't help peering over at them every so often to see what they were doing. Whatever it was, it seemed ritualistic. Not saying it was a crazy cult or anything, but that's what we thought at the time. None of it made sense to us. They would have known there were other people around because of the cars, so secrecy obviously wasn't a concern of theirs. Whatever they were doing it wasn't a typical relaxing by a campfire and making s'mores kind of camping. They were doing something, and they were there all night doing it. I saw them leave early in the morning, but didn't notice anything crazy. I do remember they had several trash bags in the back of their truck. My only normal explanation is that maybe they were doing some type of volunteer trash cleanup, team building/hazing, or some type of biological study. Has anyone ever witnessed something like this? Or have any ideas what this could have been? Number 5. I talked to alternate version of my family, and no one believes me. Around 8 or 9 years ago, I was hanging out at my old house, chowing down on some food my mom cooked for me. It was pretty early, like around 11 a.m., so my big brother was at school, and my dad was at work. After I finished eating, my mom prepared for me. The kitchen home phone started ringing, and I told my mom before she went upstairs to her room. She told me not to answer it, but as soon as she was out of sight, I just couldn't resist picking it up to see who was calling us. When I picked up the call, it was my mom's voice on the other end saying, "Hey, is this Christina?" I was like, "Yeah, why?" We had a whole chat, just like we were in the same room. But here's the weird part. My real mom was still upstairs, not on the phone with me. And while I was talking to her, I could hear my dad, who was at work, chatting with her too. I asked my mom if it was Dad, and she said it was. I even asked if I could talk to him, and she passed the phone to him. I was freaked out but curious, so I asked him what he was up to. He said he was making cereal in the kitchen. The crazy thing was, I was also in the kitchen on the phone with them. This was getting seriously weird. I started getting suspicious that my parents were playing a prank, so I thought, let's see what happens if I ask to talk to my brother. My dad handed the phone over to my supposed brother, and I got spooked and hung up. But then, the phone started ringing again, and I gave in and answered. They were asking why I hung up, and I came up with a lame excuse about needing to go to the bathroom. I asked to talk to Christina, which was actually me, and things got super eerie. I heard myself talking to me, and it was just too much. I ended the call. They kept calling a few more times, but I ignored them. Honestly, to this day, I'm still scratching my head over what went down. I've tried looking for answers and people who've been through similar stuff, but I haven't found anything that clicks. My AI buddy mentioned maybe I mixed up my memory or had some kind of wild dream, but I'm pretty sure what I experienced was as real as it gets. If anyone out there has a clue or went through something like this, help a confused soul out. This is another version of a story I made but rewrote it with less big words. I thought it would be confusing for the other people who don't know how to read like that. You can check it out on my page. Story number 6, My Sister's Haunted Dolls. The oldest of my 3 sisters had 3 Victorian-looking porcelain dolls from one of her family members. Anytime I would be in her room, it was always freezing, and just looking at the dolls gave me the heebie-jeebies. My sister moved out of the room and went off to college. She didn't want the dolls to get damaged, so she left them in the bedroom. I didn't know this, so I moved into that room. At the time of this happening, I was in 6th grade, and that's when my school district opens band up as a class. I decided I wanted to play trombone, and so I did. I always had the instrument in its case up against a wall. The entire thing in its case weighed about 10 pounds. A few nights after I moved into the room, one of the dolls shifted. It was the creepiest one. She had dark hair and a dark red dress. When she leaned to the side, my trombone fell over. Even though it was about 3 in the morning and I was scared out of my mind, I got out of bed and picked my trombone back up and went back to bed. The next night, the same thing happened, but this time the trombone was pushed 5 feet into the middle of my room. After it stopped, my fan that I always had on a low setting just stopped, and almost right after that, all of the papers and homework on me desk flew off. I was scared shitless, but I picked my bedroom up and went back to bed. The next night and every night after that, I would wake up at about 4 in the morning to some invisible force sitting on the side of my bed and stroking my hair. My door was always closed, so that my cats couldn't get in, and there's no way my fan could have caused this. I was constantly trying to debunk it. Then we moved the dolls to the basement. We had an Xbox in the basement, and whenever I would game with my friends, I'd always feel like I was being watched. Then it started playing with my hair. I even had a friend over and she got grabbed. We have since moved, and I have no idea where the dolls ended up, but I'm sure as hell glad that they're not where I live anymore. Story number 7, the time my friend's grandfather picked up a hitchhiker in the late 60s. This happened to my friend's grandfather in the 60s in California. So my friend's grandfather, let's name him Joseph. Joseph was a taxi driver and would work for many hours to support his family, and he had just gotten out of Vietnam a few months prior. One time, he was driving down a road with trees around and saw a man on the side of the road stick up the old thumb, and Joseph stopped the cab so the men can get in. Joseph said the man looked short. He had dirty long hair and bushy beard and had a weird accent. Joseph remembers the man saying, "Hey man, thanks for stopping, you're a good man." Joseph asked where he wanted to go, and the man said, "Nearest town, please." Joseph said sure, and he started driving. Joseph started to make a conversation with the man in the back of the cab. Joseph asked the man, "Where you heading?" And the man said, "I'm gonna see some family." And Joseph said, "That's nice, it's always nice to see some family." And the man chuckled and said, "It sure is, man." Joseph said he got like a very funny feeling about the man, but didn't think much of it. The convo ended, and half an hour later he arrived, and the man asked Joseph his name, and he told him. Joseph asked the man what was his. The man said, "My name is Charlie," and they both said goodbye to each other. Joseph drove off, not thinking much of it. But it wasn't until months later he saw Charlie on the news. Turns out the guy he picked up was none other than the notorious cult leader, Charles Manson. Joseph saw the news and was disturbed that he drove in a car with a psychopath. He never told anybody about it because people would think he was lying or making stuff up. Joseph passed away in 2022. And months before he passed, he told my friend and his family the story of meeting Charles Manson. Joseph got chills every time when he sees or thinks of Manson. Some people will think of Joseph making this up, but he said he doesn't care and that he will forever be creeped out by that experience. Story number 8, The Cross Shed. When my brother and I were about 16 and 14 respectively, we went on a walk to our local convenience store for snacks. It was the middle of the day during summer break and we were just bored. While we were walking, we talked about local legends a bit, and eventually we came to the topic of a really weird house not too far from our own. It was right on the corner of a main and side road, and from the naked eye it didn't seem too creepy or out of the ordinary. But if you go down the side road it's connected to for about 50 feet, you'd see that in their backyard stood an average-sized shed, but covering the outside of the shed walls was every kind size of cross you could imagine. My brother and his buddies discovered this place while they were on a night walk, as opposed to the day walk my brother and I were currently on. As my brother and his friends walked by the shed, they heard constant banging as well as the light above the shed door flickering uncontrollably. All this being considered, my brother and I decided to stroll by during the day to get a better look at the place, and possibly the people that inhabit the house itself to see what they're like. As we approached the house on the main road and veered right down the side road that would take you past the shed, we noticed there was people that lived in the house. They seemed like normal people. Maybe 2 men and 3 women, all helping unload what looked like groceries from a pickup truck. This is where things get a little weird. As my brother and I are passing the shed, we pulled out our phones to take pictures of it, and then it goes deathly silent. No more cars are driving by, no more chatter among my brother and I, and no more sound coming from the people that live in the house that were unloading groceries. The abruptness of the silence was enough to make both of us look up from our phones, and there staring at us now motionless was every one of the people that lived in the house. It felt like something from a movie. Every slight movement I made, I could feel their eyes following us. We didn't even finish taking the pictures because we were so shook. My brother and I went back a couple weeks later with the same curiosity, only to find the shed torn down, and in its place a door leading into the ground. Story number 9. No F. Around with Ouija boards, I, 33F, grew up in a haunted house. It was an old Queen Anne farmhouse in Wisconsin that was built in 1865. During WW II, it was a halfway house for soldiers returning home from the war. There were odd things that would happen pretty routinely. Radios would turn up or down on their own. Pictures would fall off shelves. My bedroom door wouldn't stay closed no matter what I did, outside of eventually putting a latch on the door. Often you could hear people talking in the next room over, but then no one would be there. There's a spot on one of the landings on the stairs that go up to the second floor that was always ice cold. Didn't matter if it was dead of summer or if the heat was turned on. Sometimes the entire house would boom and shake out of nowhere, like someone hit the house with their car. And sometimes there was a banging noise in the ceiling, which would start at one end of the house, and then rapidly, too rapidly to be some kind of critter, it would travel along the ceiling to the other side of the house. Took about 2-3 seconds. There was a freak cherry tree in the backyard that grew as tall as the house, 3 stories. There was also a young woman with blonde hair and a white dress who appeared pretty commonly to guests in the front hallway. That's just a few examples. One day when I was in middle school, a friend from school, Josie, and I decided to play around with her Ouija board. Mind you, the timing for this was not good. Josie's mom had passed away, and her dad was abusing her at home. So she had been staying with us for a few days while we figure out what to do. So things were tense and emotional, and Josie was in a vulnerable position. On top of that, we didn't know what we were doing. That night we must have made contact with something angry, or made something angry. I don't really remember how the seance started or what really led up to things getting out of hand. All I remember is looking at Josie, and she had her switchblade pressed to her own throat, with the edge against her skin. I opened my mouth to say something, yell maybe, but at that moment the bedroom door opened, shoving the chair that was holding it closed out of the way, and then slammed shut, just as the lamp on my nightstand went flying across the room, shattering against the opposite wall. When I asked her what she was doing, all she said was, "I couldn't move." Story number 10. Once a believer, always a believer. This happened a few years back when my now husband and I just began dating. He was living in a really cute house on a hill with his mom and stepfather. I have always been a believer in the paranormal. I even used to see things back when I was younger that still sends chills up my spine. Somehow I put a block to it according to a close family friend of mine who's a psychic. but part of me wanted to experience what I used to see again, now that I am older and feel that I could handle it. Anyway, when I first started going over his house, I remember one specific night he had asked me to come over for dinner as his stepdad was cooking up a storm. I remember sitting in the kitchen at their island and having a conversation with both him and his stepdad, when all of a sudden, the doorbell rang. They had a habit of keeping the front door open for their 2 dogs to stare out and gaze at the neighbors and birds that passed by. "Who was that?" I asked, looking around to see if we were expecting some more company. I knew something was wrong when my husband and stepdad looked at each other with a smirk. "You'll have to get used to that," his stepdad laughed. "It was Edna." "Who is Edna?" I asked, preparing myself for the answer I knew was coming. "Our ghost," my husband said. "She's harmless. She just likes to play pranks, especially on people who are new to our home. Once you get used to her, she won't bother you no more. But the more you're afraid and react, the more she'll bother you." I tried to hide my fear the best I could as I started to spend the weekend sleeping over. Late at night, there would be loud knocks coming from the basement, footsteps going up and down the stairs when everyone had gone to bed. But I have to say what really put the cherry on top of this harmless haunting was when I was alone in my husband's room watching TV one night. He was in the basement doing his laundry, and his mom and stepdad were in the family room a floor down from me watching a movie. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, but thought nothing of it and kept my attention on the TV. From the corner of my eye, I could make out a woman coming up the stairs who I assumed was his mom. "Hi, Val," she said softly. "Hi," I replied. I felt rude that I didn't bother to turn my face to actually see her, but I was so in tune with the show I was watching and heard the footsteps stop when she reached her room. Edna was the previous owner of the home who died there of dementia and Alzheimer's. I guess part of her didn't ever want to leave, or she had some unfinished business to take care of. After that day, she would still pull some harmless pranks, like things going missing, things being placed in one spot and moved to another, my mother-in-law's windows being washed and her seeing her apparition in the window smiling, my niece's toys being knocked over and no one there, and of course messing with that damn doorbell again. My now in-laws have sold the house and moved down to Florida, but I still wonder to this day if the new owners are experiencing what we had. I hate to say that I miss these harmless pranks. I'll never forget you, Edna. Story number 11. My true story of me encountering a full-bodied demon. In a new house that I just bought 1.5 months ago, about 2 months ago, I bought my very first house that was in the bush because I was living in a noisy town with non-stop sounds, with only 2 neighbors, who are really nice to me and to each other. Skip about 2 weeks ahead, when I had all my things with me. I started to hear weird sounds from the basement around 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning, like quite banging and weird, when I woke up in the morning to check and noticed the basement door had a heavy-duty lock on it. I was looking for the key, then eventually finding it behind the kitchen door in a cabinet. I grabbed a flashlight and my small army pocket knife, just in case it was an animal trying to get out. I unlocked it and slowly opened the door with my flashlight on and turned on the lights. Everything looked like a normal basement, really. Your water pump and all that stuff, but I noticed a corner of the room had 2 concrete walls with an old-style white door like from the 1990s. No windows on the door or walls. I opened it, and it was a 5 by 6 meter room with nothing in it. Just an empty room with no lights in it, just a lifeless room. But boy, I was completely wrong about that. I looked in the corner of the small room, and what I think I saw was a tall black figure with a V-shaped head and the body of that of a mangled human. It turned around, and that's when I could describe it even more. The eyes were solid white, and they had what looked like scribbles on them, making them look, I don't really like using this word, cursed, like from a horror movie. Then it screamed at me and started to chase me out of the basement. I dropped my knife at that point of time because I was afraid of this thing. I ran to the door, quickly closing it and locked it so it wouldn't get out. I could hear it quietly clawing and making the same sounds like the ones I hear almost every night. The next morning, I decided to board up the door with 5 boards and grabbed chains and locked it tight together so nothing would move or break out. Due to this day, I still hear sound here and there, but it's mostly active at night. I have so many questions, so I talked to my neighbor, won't say his name, that their dad told them a story of a man who did dark magic cursed that land and the house with a demon that would torment those forever as long as they live here until they move away and off the land, basically protecting the land from new people that move in. Here are some of the questions I had for myself, a little behind the story. Here are some of these I wrote down before I talked to my neighbor. Why is that thing in my basement making these noises and trying to hurt me? What was its purpose? Why is it in there in the first place? Who or what is this thing? I don't want to hear it or see it anymore. I don't know how to get rid of this thing or just to make it leave me alone. This has been going on non-stop every night for weeks now, and I can't make it stop. If anyone could help me with this issue, then that would really help me dearly. I don't want to result in moving out because I have nowhere else to go right now. Type down a comment. If you think you might know how to get rid of this thing, or how to help me in this hell of a situation. Thank you. Story number 12. First time getting threatened by a gun. This happened about a year ago. I was living in Barrio Logan in San Diego at the time. My place was the side entrance of a duplex, and the house was right next to a park. One night at around 11 p.m., I was playing Call of Duty. I had my front door open and the screen door locked to help cool down the house. As I was playing with friends, I heard screaming outside but thought it was just my game. I then heard it again, followed by a female scream. My friends over my headset pointed it out and asked me what was going on in my house. I replied to them that I thought that was my game. Nothing is happening in my home. I got up and checked outside. Right across the street, there was a man shoving a woman around the street and punched her while she was screaming. She pulls out her phone and he grabbed it and threw it across the road at my fence. He never saw me. He then runs around the corner and she goes the opposite way. I run out and catch her around the corner and try helping her out. She kept walking and blankly stared at me over her shoulder. I asked her if she had somewhere to go and she didn't reply. I asked if she needed help, and with that she replied with, "Go away," in a shaky voice. I was going to turn back to my house when the man whips around the corner and starts screaming at me. He starts telling me that I'm getting into something that I don't need to be in. I got a weird feeling off of that guy. He then puts his hand under his shirt and asks if I'm trying to get shot. I backed off and said, "Hey, I'm sorry. Wasn't trying to get in someone's business. I just saw her crying and asked if she was okay, but I'll let you handle it." I walk past him to go back home and he starts walking behind me. I started sprinting and sprinted all the way around the block, took the back entrance to the alley and went inside. I called the police and 5 minutes later, 5 squad cars zoomed by my home. Not sure if they caught the guy or not. Story number 13, what I found. At an abandoned psychiatric hospital, true occult story. I'd like to preface this story by acknowledging that the truthfulness or reliability of asylum or escaped mental patient stories tends to be questionable. The reason why I'm skeptical of those stories is that large-scale closures of asylums began in 1967 through the 1980s and were completely decommissioned by 2015. So I raise my eyebrow whenever someone talks about spooky asylum stories that happened within the last 2 decades or so. Still, I will be sharing my story as factually as my memory allows and refrain from exaggerating any aspect because, unfortunately, this story is true through and through. I often visited my grandparents' home in Traverse City in northern Michigan during the summers with my parents. Traverse City, TC, is a beautiful place, produces 75% of the world's cherries, and was home to the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital, which operated from 1885 to 1989. Since the United States federal government officially deemed the hospital worthy of preservation for its historical significance, the buildings on the hospital grounds were guarded by patrolling security guards. The TC Psychiatric Hospital was massive, including 70 or 80 buildings of various sizes. Some buildings have now been converted into restaurants, gift shops, tourism traps, cafes, etc., but many remain empty and abandoned. Underneath the hospital is a sprawling brick tunnel system, which the hospital staff used to safely transport the patients from building to building in the frigid winter temperatures. I am sure there were instances where the patients underwent cruel treatments or were subjected to the care of horrible doctors, but the TC Psych Hospital had a great reputation. Many teenagers, including myself at the time, were unashamedly fascinated with the hospital and its history. As a result, We would often break into abandoned buildings through unbarred windows or doors with pickable padlocks. While there were a few cases where teens would get caught and charged with breaking and entering, as long as we were stealthy, stuck to our safe entrances, and paid attention to the guards' patrol patterns, we could go in and out without worry. I'm not advocating for or trying to justify my criminal act of B and E, but breaking into the old hospital was almost a rite of passage for the TC teens. The hospital's interior was terrifying. There was old, stained, and broken equipment and furniture, crumbling floors and walls, vandalism, strange old building noises, and complete and utter darkness in the tunnels, basements, and lower floors. Using flashlights was too risky with the guards patrolling, so we often navigated the hospital by memory and our dimly lit phone screens. As you can imagine, our frightened youthful imaginations ran wild with horror stories, which is pretty ironic considering we made up most of those stories. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I never encountered anything supernatural in all of my trips to the abandoned TC Psych Hospital. Unfortunately, during my last trip inside, I encountered something all too human that terrified me to the point I swore off ever returning. The story takes place around 10 p.m. The moonlight was dim and most patrol guards left for the day. Clad in black, my friend Jason and I entered through the same window we always used and followed our regular path to one of the tall, jutting spires to sit by the windows that overlooked the entire city. There was only one thing different about this venture from our others: a new, faint, and unexplainable smoky odor, not smoky like fire, but something more akin to incense. The smell was so faint we almost thought we were imagining it, but it grew stronger as we got closer to our destination. Rather than taking the stairs that led up to the spire, we followed the smell down a different hallway until we reached a room with a deep red glow emanating from the doorway. Rather than doing the smart thing by leaving immediately, we couldn't resist the urge to walk closer and investigate. When we finally reached the room, I audibly gasped and felt Jason grip my wrist so hard his nails left marks on my skin. We found a large ring of red votive candles and burning incense circling a drawing of a pentagram with the sigil of Baphomet. In the center of the drawing was a dead, bloodied bird surrounded by black feathers. Bear in mind that I was raised devoutly Catholic, so seeing this image filled me with a sense of fear stronger and more paralyzing than any ghost sighting ever could. Later on that night, Jason told me I immediately started mumbling prayers, but I personally don't remember doing that. I wouldn't be too terribly surprised, though. While the duration felt infinite, I'm not sure how long we stared at the occult scene before hearing a man's low and ominous voice behind us saying, "Welcome, friends." I promise you that there was absolutely nothing friendly about the way that guy greeted us. Jason and I screamed bloody murder, whipped around, and saw two nicely dressed but frazzled-looking adult men smiling at us. The man in front of me held something in his hand, and while I can't say for sure what it was, I remember thinking it was a knife at the time, which wouldn't be too crazy of a guess considering they recently sacrificed a bird. Jason and I sprinted past the two, and I felt someone's fingers grab the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the occultist's hand didn't have a solid hold on me because I ducked and managed to escape his grip. The men shouted for us to stop running. We obviously didn't. We heard their footsteps chasing after us for a little while, but thankfully Jason and I had broken into the hospital so many times that running through the unlit rooms, hallways, and tunnels was no challenge. When we finally reached and vaulted through our escape window, the occultists were nowhere to be seen or heard. We kept running through the hospital grounds until we reached Jason's car with no concern for the patrol guards. We would have rather gotten caught by the guards than the occultists. I puked twice in the parking lot. Whether the cause was fear, sprinting nonstop for a mile and a half, or a combination of both. I'm not sure what would have happened if the occultists caught us, but I know for certain they weren't going to crack open a beer and sing Kumbaya by the candlelight. I'm not familiar with cultic practices or satanic rituals, so I'm not sure what the men were trying to do or if they were summoning something. If anyone reading this post is more knowledgeable on the topic, please share your thoughts. Jason and I never returned to the hospital during that summer or any of the following summers. While we aren't close now that we're adults, I know that horrifying experience will keep us cemented in each other's memories until we die. 4 comments. Story number 14. I can't find my grave. I'm not sure where to even begin with this, but it started with death. Going into my senior year, we lost a fellow student in a car accident. Pretty intense situation. I knew the girl named Taylor and had seen her in the hall only a few weeks before and said hi. We were never great friends, but we had a few mutual and had spoken recently on chat about the guy we both knew named Eric, who was a few years older than us. After Taylor passed away so tragically, and a lot of hurt was seeping into our community. The mutual friend was devastated at the news, he becomes important to the story, and met with her family for the first time after her death. Taylor came to me in a dream that night. I was looking at her from across desks when we never had a class together. I said, "Taylor, why are you here? You shouldn't be here." In my dream, my friend Jade turned around and said, "Who are you talking to?" Taylor was disappeared before I could point out she was clearly there. All of a sudden, I was in this local graveyard beneath this tree on a hill with her. She just kept repeating in sobs, "I'm so scared, I'm so cold, I don't know why I'm here, please help me. I want my mom. I want to go home." All I could do was try to get words out to comfort her or something, but nothing came of it, and I woke up. There was a service a few weeks later majority of our school attended. She was driven away in a hearse with her family behind for a private burial in the local cemetery. I caught up with our friend Eric at the service, and he had said they picked the most beautiful spot for her, on a hill, under a tree. I had no way of knowing that, and I had dreamt of Taylor a few weeks prior to it. To this day, it seemed so real when she came to me in my dream, that she was really crying out for help to one of the few people that may have been able to hear her. I've had a few crazy experiences with paranormal happenings, and I'd be happy to share them, but it's always a somber feeling when I realize they aren't made up, that the fear I felt through every experience was real. The people around me felt real fear. There's so much more to this world we'll ever know. Story number 14, a stalker. In the woods, decided to drive to the largest forest in my county in hopes of getting back in touch with nature, needing to clear my head. I asked the local forestry office the best place for a quick walk off of the main trails and was directed to this picturesque spot a little ways down the road. No reception with the rare bit of blue sky we get in the UK. I was glad I made the spontaneous trip, and as I walked further down the path, I saw a clearing in the trees to my right. Since the plan was to get closer with nature, I ventured into the trees off the beaten path. It was great. I explored the area, listened to the birds as they swooped from branch to branch. Even got a good 5 minutes of meditation in before I heard what sounded like two animals fighting. I assumed they were just foxes and moved on. I unexpectedly reached this sand road as I emerged from the trees, but decided to walk along it for a moment as I scanned for an entry into the forest on the other side of the road. But as I looked around, I spotted a broad dangling from a bush near the road. Now I'm aware people go to the forest for all sorts of reasons, but this did put me slightly on edge. As I turned around, I heard an electric car making its way up the road. By the time I heard it, it was less than 300 yards away. My instincts told me to hide or just avoid being seen, but there was no time, so I simply gave a polite nod as he passed and made my way in the opposite direction. He parks up behind me, just out of view. I begin to make my way off of the road, intending to go explore further. But when I saw the car, for a moment, doing a 180 turn then parking again, something told me to turn around and go back the way I came. As I made my way back onto the road, I spot this man in a white shirt behind the bush the bra was hanging from. He was going in the direction I just changed course from. I crossed the road and made my way back into the forest I had arrived on the sand road from. When I got slightly further in, I turned around to check if the man continued in the opposite direction, but he didn't. Instead, I see he has also crossed the road and is making his way into the part of the woods I entered. By this point, I knew I was being followed. There was no way he coincidentally went one way, then turned to head into this part of the forest that I entered. But I kept my pace brisk, rather than running. My physical health can go south quick. My knees are brittle and my ankles are weak. So rushing could cost me, especially since I still had to reach my car and drive away. As I traveled further, he was always following, was cursing my luck as I made my way to the end of that section of the forest, just before the path that was after a large patch of grass and shrubbery. But as I looked back, I couldn't see him. I stopped for longer than I should have, scanning the trees and listening intently, but I hear nothing, see nothing. I make my way back onto the path with some relief and turn one last time to check the tree line. When I see he's not there, I begin considering I was overthinking the whole situation. But just as those thoughts cross my mind, I see the man emerge from the opposite side from where he was previously. At the edge of the tree line, he just stared at me. But I wasn't going to take any more chances, so I made my way down the path and back to my car, making sure to get out of there quickly as I knew he would have to head down the same tight country road. I reported the man to the forestry office, but there wasn't much they could do. So that was it. When I paused at the tree line when I couldn't see him, for him to have emerged from where he did when I had made it back to the path, he had to have approached from another angle, an angle that I admittedly wasn't checking. But I'm glad I never went further into the forest. I'm glad I followed my instincts. Otherwise, the only way back would have been through him. And God knows what his intentions were. Story number 15, Manus Context. Okay, so, before I get into the spooks and mystery, let me start by saying that all this is 100% legit. My family has something strange going on, none of this has been fraudulent, and I am a bit of a skeptic. So I am 100% with all of you in the realm of uncertainty. Still, I will tell the story of the strange handprints and activity at my mother's house. My name is Elijah, and I live in Milton, Vermont. I live with my grandmother and grandfather, and we live in a very isolated area. My mother lives in Burlington, Vermont, and I do not live with my mother as she has been struggling financially, although she is the most excellent mother anyone could ever ask for. My little sister Marissa currently resides in the residence with my mother at Northgate Apartments. This is the critical location for everything. I have written a creepypasta using the image from my mother's basement, as it has been chilling enough to inspire me. It all began in Northgate 404 when I lived with my mother. I would recall hearing strange noises radiating from the radiator. No pun intended. And the noises would haunt me significantly to the point where I would stay awake for literal hours. I was sleep-deprived when arriving at school. My teacher seemed genuinely concerned for me every time I came looking like a zombie until one day I returned home on the bus, exhausted as always. I noticed the basement door had been left wide open. I yelled up the stairs to my mom, asking if she had left the basement door open, and she yelled no back down to me, so I closed the door without a second thought. Every time I lay in bed, I felt like my eyes were watching me, and my friends always stated that they felt pressure every time they came over to visit. It was strange, but nothing short of a possible coincidence. 6 years later, I no longer live in those apartments with my mother due to her trouble supporting my siblings and me. But my mother still currently resides in the apartment. My mother and my little sister Marissa come over frequently to visit for lunch and always come over and relay the real and strange experiences in these complex apartments. One day on our way home from church in the car, I was talking about my favorite horror games, and then my mother was talking about a strange handprint on the wall in the basement that just happened to appear. I am super skeptical and love all things horror, so this story intrigued me. I asked my mother if she had been home or if Marissa had been home. My mother works at Walmart pretty intensely as a team lead, and my little sister attends school pretty much every day. And the handprint is not children-sized, as I have learned. My mother explained that this wasn't the only strange event at the apartment. Objects move independently, as if misplaced or lost, and not where they originally were. For example, a figurine of a church seemed to move from the kitchen into the living room. A lamp seemingly fell over. And finally, my mother's boyfriend at the time had been locked in the bathroom room upstairs. While my mother was downstairs cleaning the dishes, my mother's boyfriend began to harass my sister Marissa and demand answers as to why she had locked him in the bathroom. These small things were bizarre, so I decided to investigate further. I returned to my mother's apartment where I used to live, and it felt as strange yet familiar as it did before. I took my flashlight and my EMF downstairs. Yep, I brought my EMF, and I began to search for this so-called handprint, and then I found it on the wall in the messy and cold basement. For some reason, all of the hairs stood on my arms and neck. I felt like I was freezing, and then I got a headache after staring at this handprint for about 5-ish minutes. I was uncomfortable, and the vibes radiating from that basement were horrifying. My mother has moved from 404 to 453 and still experiences strange occurrences, 404 to 453, and still experiences strange events. For example, a trash can slides across the floor and peculiar scratch noises are heard from the basement, even when the cat is upstairs. Somehow, my mother's keys ended up in the basement just recently, and this is most certainly where she would least likely put her keys. And then, not too later, a handprint appears again in the basement. I knew I had to see it. I knew I had to investigate and record this phenomenon. Perhaps whatever it is has followed her. But the day I went to my mother's new apartment in 453, I photographed the unique handprint on the basement wall and photographed it. A month later, a strange handprint appeared on the wall above my computer. Very close to the ceiling, and consistently, the lights flickered in my house, and my hair stood up at random times throughout the day. I have also photographed this. Further information. In between 404 and 453 was 72, and my mother had claimed to have seen a ghostly apparition on the ceiling when the lights flickered and a cake had randomly fallen to the floor. However, it had been residing in the middle of the table. Story number 16. Creepy confession. Decades ago in my youth, I lived in a small town in India without modern amenities like smartphones, video games, or the internet. Entertainment back then was going to the cinema, a special treat for us kids. I vividly remember a particular night when I eagerly went to watch a re-released old black and white film in a theater called Vijaya Mahal. The cinema was on the eastern side of town, separated from our place by a major railway line. Although it was a late-night show, I managed to get permission from my family. After an exciting evening at the movies, the show ended around 1 a.m., and I made my way back home. Instead of taking the safe route through the manned railway gate, I decided to take a shortcut and cross the railway tracks directly. As I walked in the darkness, lost in my thoughts about the movie, I suddenly felt something soft at my feet. Unable to see clearly, I curiously reached down and found my hand grasping long, wet hair. Startled, I realized I was looking at a human head without a body nearby. Fear engulfed me, and I hurriedly moved away. With my senses heightened, I carefully made my way back, avoiding any mishaps, and managed to reach the other side of the railway line. Once there, I couldn't forget the eerie encounter. The next day, the local newspaper reported that a woman had committed suicide by jumping in front of a train. This haunting incident remained etched in my memory, and I couldn't share it with anyone for a long time. It took me a while to overcome the fear and to see darkness as just darkness again, without the haunting image of that night. Story number 17. The coincidence that scared me to hell. This happened around 5 years ago. I was working in a pretty decent hotel as a bartender, and part of our job description was to deliver room service to people or complimentary drinks, food that the reception asked us to deliver. One night, I got an order to the 4th floor trough the reception. Now it is important that it was the 4th floor because that was the only floor in the hotel that had no windows to the outside and the end of the hallways, or anywhere for that matter. It was also the cheapest floor, and it was not renovated in years to a point that there were boot marks on the walls, ceiling, and patches of paint hanging from the ceiling as well. Other floors were well maintained. I don't know why that was the case. Anyway, on the end of each hallway instead of a window was a huge mirror almost the size of the entire hallway, which gave an illusion of an infinite corridor with the mirrors being on both sides of the hall. Halfway through the hallway in both directions were fire doors that were held by electromagnets from what I can tell. So there I go up to the 4th and to the end of the hallway where the room I needed to go to was. As I approached the room, I could hear people talking faintly because the door was open and light was spilling into the hallway. As I got closer, the talking stopped, and now I could only hear the static noise of a TV. I knocked on the open door and said, "Room service," but no one responded. I slowly walked into the room, knocking again. Got a few people scared a couple of times before, so I was being careful. But as I got inside, I realized the room was empty. At this point, I am creeped out by the empty room, static TV, and 4th floor in general. I quickly put the drinks on the table and left. As I was approaching the fire doors, the lights on the floor went out and the doors slammed shut on me just as I was about to go trough them. The lights went out only in the hall, because I could still see the light from the room and hear the TV static, which was getting louder and coming from all around. I felt adrenaline rush through my body as I ran down the stairs, didn't want to wait for the elevator, and ran straight outside for a smoke. The fourth floor always creeped me out, but since that time I found ways not to go up there at night any longer. The floor itself got renovated about a year later and it became way less creepy, but I still had a weird feeling when I got up there. Story number 18, a skinwalker. So one fine day I got a text from my friends. It's a good rainy day, let's go to a waterfall nearby. Where do they get this energy to climb a hill when it's raining this heavy? Why can't they enjoy a nice cup of tea or coffee and a playlist? Ah well, either way there was no point in denying because they would drag me out my house anyway. So we decided to set out in evening. I had a great place in my mind. We reached there around 5:30 p.m. Even though I had planned to laze around in my room, witnessing such scene of mountain covered with the blanket of fog and distance view of waterfall was worth the trip. It was less to no crowd as it was a weekday. When we started climbing, it took 4 of us around 20 miles to reach the waterfall. The view from up there of the city was mesmerizing. There was a very small area surrounded by big rocks at summit of waterfall. Flow had created hot spring-style potholes, one below another. There were few people up there, around 4, 5 except us. As the waterfall was loud, it was hard to communicate without yelling. We are kind of group who just enjoy the company of each other, even though there is no conversation going on. We all sat in one of those potholes in silence, vibing with the feeling of flowing water, enchanting view and sound of fall. It was a bliss. We all drifted off. After some time passed by, as I was lost in thoughts, admiring the view, I noticed a small broken branch of white flower flowing beside me. I watched it flow down one pothole to another. It was peaceful. Watching it flow off until it went out of view in thick forest, that's when I jolted out of my daydream. I looked back wondering what my friends were up to, and they were all still drifting off on their own. One's laying down enjoying the flow, and other is sky-gazing. I started noticing something strange. It was quite I couldn't hear people talking, laughing as before I looked back and I realized the place was deserted. We were the only ones left behind. When checked my watch, it made me feel uneasy, because when we came here and sat down, it was around 6:15 p.m. For what I and everyone with me had thought had spent 15 minutes idling, there was a 45 minutes time gap we could not explain. When I told them it's almost 7 p.m., they all thought I was joking, but after confirming they had confused yet blank look on their face and didn't know what to make out of this situation. At moment, we decided not to overthink about it and decided to descend as it was getting dark, because whatever luck we had, the sunset was late that day. As we started our way down with the chit-chat, I was still bugged about the fact that all 4 of us were sitting there ideally for almost an hour, and none of us noticed, and how I didn't notice people leaving. As I was overflowing in these thoughts, I heard a whistling sound come from the forest edge of the trail we were walking. Just to give you readers a clear idea of the trail, it was a narrow path on the edge of the hill, and down below was slide of deep forestation. I looked at my friends to see if anyone heard it too, but they all seemed to be busy with their conversation. I shrugged it off as it may be a bird. As I continued few steps down, I heard it again. A whistle, kind of which sounded very human. I watched my friends walking in front of me as they all looked in same direction as the sound came from down the edge. First, when we heard the whistle, it sounded casual. But as we paced further, the tone changed and sounded way more like it wanted our attention. The conversation between them was slowly dying down as they were starting to realize what the situation was. I also noticed the whistling was coming from the same distance, even though we were moving as if whatever was making that sound was maintaining the same 5 to 10 meters distance between us. Well, to say it clearly, following us. And I guess everyone with me had started to realize this without me saying. Now the thing about late-time sunset is, it lits the sky as long as it does, and in a matter of minds, it is dark as middle of a night. It seemed like our luck ran out on us. We were almost out of the forest area, but it was pitch dark and we were at the mercy of our phones, flashlight, and slippery muddy trails were not any help for our pace. I was walking up front because some turns needed a support hand to pass by. As we were almost out of this forest, I was starting to feel a little hopeful. Only if I had knew it was a false feeling. Something happened which none of us had expected. A sound of a branch breaking following with a whistle. It sent a chill down everyone's spine. My heart was racing faster than ever. I looked back and everyone was froze on their tracks like a deer in headlights. I wanted to flash the light towards the direction of the sound, but something screamed inside of me to leave it alone. Somehow calming myself, I instead checked on my friends. Two of them were holding on somehow, but the one who was walking in last. She had tears up her eyes, almost ready to give up and scream her lungs out for help. Honestly, she would have done that if she wasn't paralyzed by fear. I could sense she or none of them wanted to be last person standing. I knew everyone, including me, just wanted to run like the hell broke loose, but that would have only led to some serious casualty as the path was filled with sharp stones. I muster up of whatever hope I had left for not to panic, walked all the way back, tapped on her shoulders, signaling her to moving forward while joking on how she is slowing us down. In my mind, I begged that they would go along and not cause the scene, and for the sake of it, they did, laughing awkwardly on the joke and pacing forward. All life on Earth, including humans, animal, birds, and even insects, share one thing among their DNA, that is, instinct, a necessity for survival. At that moment, not out of fear, but something inside us was telling us that something was lurking in that slope of thick forest, the slope which was nearly impossible to stand or walk through it for any normal human. Somehow we all knew, we absolutely cannot acknowledge the whistle, or that there is something in those bushes. After what it felt like forever, we managed to get out of the forest. We rushed towards our bikes and took off as fast as we could. Coming into the city, the sound of traffic and lights calmed us down. I noticed we were all shivering of cold and maybe fear. I made a stop at a tea stall. The warmth of tea was soothing. As time passed by, the fear was starting to fade away and curiosity took its place. We started brainstorming on what did actually happen to us. Were we scared of random noises? Was our brain messing with us out of fear? Many theories and logical reasoning can be created out of it, and we came up with best theory, that it could have been a bird that mimics humans. Sound reasonable, right? After all, some crows and parrot can basically have conversations. How hard can it be for it to whistle? And we all shrugged it off. As days passed by, it still didn't fit right with me, so I decided to do some search about this place. Usual, like what kind of birds and animals are found in the area. Well, to my surprise, there were none of the birds native that could mimic sounds. Also, it is supposed to be the hunting ground for kites. So birds smaller in size tend to avoid the area, which threw out parrot theory out of the equation. As I went down the rabbit hole, I found something that made my blood cold and made matter much worse. Apparently, there were several cases of suicides and accidental deaths of many men, women, and children, some of which the bodies were never found. Police officers always seal the entrance with barricades during heavy rainy days, but some local always managed to slip past by and had met with such unfortunate accidents. I could not find any stories similar to ours, but then again, this spot was not known to many and was only known to locals. As I'm documenting this down, I to this day have no explanation to what could have happened to us that day. Ghost? Or something out of a folklore like skinwalkers, or a mind game of fear. I would leave this to your imagination. Story number 19. A man tried to force me and my friends into his car, and I'm scared that would have been my last night alive. It had just gone past the transition of New Year's 2022 into the first day of 2023 at about 2-3 a.m. Me and my two best friends, who we'll call Lena and Maria, had taken a 2-hour train to a town called Barnsley in the UK. I had started dating a boy there, and my friends were excited to meet him. We were all 18 and had decided to go clubbing with my boyfriend and his friends when Lena started to feel tired at 2-3 a.m. Her and Maria had made our way to a bus stop. Of course, it was too late to get on one, but we were talking about calling a taxi. My boyfriend was very intoxicated, so I told him he didn't have to stay with us and left him at the club. Suddenly, as we're talking, a man dressed in all black came from behind the bus stop. "I heard you need a free ride," he said with a strong accent I couldn't pinpoint. Already tired and a bit intoxicated ourselves, the idea seemed good at first, believing he had good intentions. He asked us where we're staying, and we stupidly told him, when Maria stepped in and politely said, "I'm sorry, but in this day and age, girls can't trust to get in strange cars." The man looked offended, and he showed us his wedding ring, which looked very cheap and fake. "See, I'm a married man. I promise I won't murder and rape you like Ted Bundy." The way he said it in such an excited tone made my heart drop. My friend seemed to feel similar as she immediately rung the taxi company, but the taxi wouldn't be here for at least 10 minutes. The man sat right next to me at the bus stop, asking me if I'm in a relationship and my age. He looked about 40. My wife works night shifts and I'm so lonely, so I've come out tonight looking for a new woman. I comforted him awkwardly, telling him I'll talk to him while we wait for the taxi. He told us about his suicidal intentions if we didn't get in the car with him, and he told us he just wants to rant to us all in his car. Before we could decline, he got up and opened the back door of his car, and Maria looked at me anxiously and whispered, "What if he pulls out a weapon?" Anxiety came over me, and I took a few steps back in bewilderment and began spam calling my boyfriend and all his friends at the club. None of them picked up, and the man turned his car lights off and was heard locking the doors before yelling us over again. Thankfully, the taxi arrived and we all jumped in it and called the police, while telling the man in the taxi to turn back round only to see the same man was sat waiting in his car by the bus stop, now with his headlights back on, waiting for the next vulnerable drunk young girls.